The last developmental theory that we'll go over here today in class is something that got written really right around the same time as Terry Moffat was writing her dual taxonomy. And that was the work of two criminologists named Rob Sampson and John Lobb. You might remember the name Rob Sampson from earlier in the class when we talked about neighborhood control theory, because he's someone who also has shown an interest in that. But Sampson and Lobb were scholars back in 1993 who became, like many others, engaged in this age crime debate. They believed that the understanding of criminal behavior couldn't just be explained by either looking at careers or looking at things like stable traits, like self-control. So in terms of the age crime debate, they didn't actually really fall that much on one side or the other, as much as they said, regardless of where you fall on this, there's much too much of a focus in criminology on adolescence. Pretty much what most people had done up to that point in criminology was study the path into delinquent behavior kind of ending in adolescence. And for them, that's very unsatisfactory. What they thought was important to do was look at criminal behavior over a person's entire life course, all the way from childhood to adulthood, and explain what forces along the way either cause you to continue to commit crime or enable you to stop committing crime. So what they did is they wrote a book in 1993 called Crime in the Making. And the book is actually, I think the full title of the book is Crime in the Making: Pathways and Turning Points Through Life. And that title will tell you a lot about how they believe criminal behavior plays out in a person's life, as you'll see a little bit later. But it's interesting to think about how it is that they came about doing this research. So Sampson and Lobb essentially stumbled upon in the Harvard basements, the Harvard record collections back in the early 90s, upon a data set that we now call the Gluck data. And what the Gluck data contained was research from the city of Boston dating back to the 1930s that was collected by a married couple who were a research team called Sheldon and Eleanor Gluck. So Sheldon and Eleanor Gluck back in the 1950s collected this data on boys that were born in the 1930s. And what they did is they collected 500 delinquent boys' information, boys that were, at the time of their study, in a delinquency, in a reformatory, and 500 controls, 500 boys that didn't have any signs of delinquent behavior. And they collected a ton of information about these kids. They collected biological information. They did body measurement. This is still back in the 50s, so they did some very meticulous collection of things like body measurements, personality tests, criminal behavior, and a lot of other things like what kind of life they had before they were in the study. Were their parents married? Were they rich? Were they poor? A lot of information. And they matched the kids in the reformatory to 500 kids who looked a lot like the reformatory kids in every way, except for the fact that they happened to have found themselves in detention in adolescence. So this is a longitudinal study because what Sampson and Lobb did is they found this data, the data that was collected back in the 1950s about these boys, and they followed up with the men back from that study in the 1990s. So these men were in their 70s at this point. And they followed up with them. And what they did is they put together a database tracking these men's behavior throughout their life. It's one of the longest studies of tracking individual people's behavior that we really have on record. And they did it in a mixed data collection way. What I mean by that is not only did they collect things like official police records, whether or not these men had been arrested, but they went back and they took narratives, they took interviews with these men, and took down various aspects of their life history to try to see if different things in these people's life histories had anything to do with stopping or starting or continuing to commit crime. So the theory that Sampson and Lobb came up with was a theory that they named an age-graded theory of informal social control. So let's talk about that name first of all, because it's a theory with a very long name, and the name should tell you a little bit about where it is that they're trying to place this theory in terms of criminology. First of all, this is obviously a theory that believes in the ideas of informal social control. In other words, similar to social disorganization and Hershey's ideas of social bonds, Sampson and Love do believe that the amount of control that you experience from external forces, whether it's from things like the police, parents, a spouse, children, anything that kind of controls you, that keeps you from committing crime, is something that's important to think about. That without those things controlling us, we would be free to commit crime. So that's kind of the perspective that they approach their theory from. And it's an age-graded theory because they believe that different kinds of social control are going to matter at different stages, at different ages. So whatever age you happen to be in, we should look at the types of social control that are going to be important to you at that stage. Sampson and Lobb started out their paper with three basic hypotheses. Their book with three basic hypotheses. The first one has to do with these ideas of informal social control. That a weakness of informal social control from things like family and school is going to be important in explaining delinquency in childhood and adolescence. So right there, their theory sounds a lot like some of the other social control individual level theories we've learned about. Similar to Travis Hershey in his original work, Sampson and Lobb are agreeing that yes, in childhood and adolescence, if you don't experience a lot of social control from things like your family, your peers, school, that's going to explain why you might commit crime. They also present the hypothesis that there is going to be continuity within their data set in antisocial behavior from childhood to adulthood. In other words, they're primarily looking at adults here and asking them to trace back on their behavior, asking them to recall and report back on what's happened to them throughout their life. And what Sampson and Lobb are hypothesizing is that the people who report antisocial and delinquent problem behavior as children are also going to be highly likely to have those problems persist into adulthood. So they're not arguing that continuity doesn't exist. They're saying, no, there is continuity. But, and here's where they really kind of separate their theory from others, what's important in explaining changes in criminal behavior over time is the kind of social bonds that you're able to establish in adulthood. Despite any problems that you might have, and then you might have had with you in early childhood, people have the ability to change. And the way that you change is by strengthening and establishing bonds to things socially in adulthood. So they didn't like the idea. Sampson and Lobb don't like the idea of breaking people into trajectories, right? They don't really agree with Terry Moffat's ideas because trajectories imply that once you're on that trajectory, there's not much you can do to get off of it. That's not what Sampson and Lobb say. Sampson and Lobb say that despite any problem behavior that you have in childhood, if things happen to you in adulthood that help you to strengthen your social bonds, that can be enough to change your criminal behavior. So yes, some people who start life being antisocial and delinquent and causing problems, yes, some of them are going to be problems throughout their life. There is continuity, but people do have the ability to change. So they believed this, and their study of these Gluck men showed that boys from very similar beginnings have very diverse outcomes. You think about this data set again. This is about 1,000 boys, all taken from inner city Boston, South Boston specifically, and all of them having fairly similar childhoods, fairly similar risk factors. Some of them displayed early signs of delinquent behavior, others didn't. And what Samson and Lob did is they showed that despite all of that, despite all of these problems that might have happened earlier in these kids' lives, it was what happened in terms of entering into adulthood and forming social bonds that really played a large role in what kind of a life they were going to have, in what kind of criminal behavior they were going to show over their lifetime. So let's talk about some of the terms and ideas that they introduced here. The first idea that they introduced was that there are trajectories that people tend to fall on. There are pathways or lines of development over the life course. You can, kind of in retrospect, fit people onto typical trajectories. You can have trajectories of things like work life, a trajectory of your marriage, a trajectory of parenthood. You can have a trajectory of criminal behavior. But what also mattered, according to them, were the transitions that you make throughout your life. So transitions were things that they defined as being marked life events such as getting your first job or beginning your first marriage. These things are embedded within your trajectories, but they're in short time spans. You can transition into being somebody who is working, transition into somebody who is married, transition into fatherhood, motherhood. All of these things are things that happen along the way, along each individual person's kind of trajectory in life. And what's important is if those transitions are life events that cause a change, that cause you to become reinvested, become socially bonded to whatever these transitions were, they can be enough to turn into a turning point in your life. So the transitions that they talked about as being really important were things like getting a job, getting married. These were men that had the opportunity of serving in World War II, so a lot of them cited entering into the army as being, entering into military service as being a big transition in their life. Anything that you enter into that is something that causes you to change, that causes you to reroute your life, is important according to Samson and Love, because what you're doing during that process is you're finding things to bond to. If you're someone, think about this example. If you're, let's say, you're a young boy who pretty much from early childhood up all the way through your early 20s, you got into all kinds of trouble. You stole things, you robbed people, you beat people up. Then you met a woman and fell in love with her and decided to get married. And because of this marriage to this woman that you care about, you want to be a better person. You don't want to screw that relationship up. You have something to now live for, to care for, to invest in. So you stop committing crime. That would be an example of the kind of turning point that Samson and Love believes, if it's significant enough and it's something that you feel strongly enough about, can be a turning point. So this is an age-created theory because these things that you can bond to and create turning points for in your life, those are gonna change a little bit depending on your stage in the life course. It could be the case that once you enter adolescence and you had gotten into a lot of trouble, maybe you start your first job as a teenager, and that's something that gives you enough to become invested in, that you change yourself. In adulthood, it's things like marriage and parenthood and employment. Things that you can become invested in adulthood are going to be a little bit different, but as long as it's something that's going to increase the amount of bond that you feel to pro-social, non-criminal society, that could be enough to cause you to change, according to them. So let's think about a little bit what they're saying here about a person's stability of their behavior and a person's ability to change. Because Samson and Lobb's take on this is very different from people like Gottfredson and Hershey, from people who believe that things like low self-control stay with you all your life. Samson and Lobb really disagree with that. They say that individual differences in behavior can't just be due to stable traits that you establish early in life. The individual differences of behavior are going to be influenced by things at each stage of a person's life. You're not different from someone else in your kind of birth cohort because of something that happened to you when you're 6. You could be different from that person because something that's happening right now. So they also disagree that people stop committing crime just because they age out. So if you remember, that was the idea of Gottfredson and Hershey, right? That people desist from crime just because they do. They get older, they grow out of it. Samson and Lobb did not like that idea very much. And they really believed that it's important to actually understand and explore why people desist from crime. Because they believe that people desist from crime because something spectacular or exceptional happens in their life that can cause them to turn away from crime. And they do acknowledge that some people display a remarkable amount of continuity in their behavior. Some people who are, bad eggs when they're little kids are going to grow up and become criminal. But Gottfredson and Hershey say that's not because of a trait that they had. It's because of, over time, they kind of accumulate weak social bonds throughout their life. In other words, what happens to you in childhood is going to impact your ability to be successful at different stages of the life course. Not because of a trait, but because if you're someone who was never really properly socialized in early childhood, once you get up into adolescence, you're not going to be able to bond to things like peers, things like romantic relationships. You're not going to be able to hold down jobs for very long. And then in adulthood, there are going to be new things that are going to be disrupted in terms of your ability to establish social bonds. So according to them, continuity in behavior is actually the accumulated impact of weak social bonds throughout your life. Something that they also called cumulative continuity. That over time, it's kind of like a snowballing effect, that problems that happen to you in childhood are problems then, but they also make your ability to transition and form turning points less and less likely. Okay, so that's the end of today's lecture. Next time we're going to talk about critical and integrated theories, and you're going to read chapter 7 from your Hagen textbook.